In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed a piece of paper that would reshape the entire American West. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres of free land to any adult citizen or anyone who intended to become one, as long as they were willing to live on it, farm it, and stick it out for 5 years. The filing fee was about $18. For families who had nothing, that was the price of a future. Hundreds of thousands of people took that deal. They packed everything they owned into canvas-covered wagons and rolled west across the Missouri River into the Great Plains, chasing cheap land and the promise that hard work would be enough. Civil War veterans came with discharge papers in hand, since the act gave them extra concessions. European immigrants arrived by the shipload, many of them barely speaking English, all of them hungry for soil they could call their own. Freed slaves headed west looking for a fresh start away from the ruins of the South. There was just one problem nobody had solved. They arrived on a landscape so vast and treeless that the grass grew 3 to 5 feet tall and the horizon line was nothing but a flat seam between earth and sky. There wasn't a single tree thick enough to split into cabin logs for miles in every direction. The log homes these families had known back in Ohio, Indiana, and the forests of Germany and Scandinavia were impossible out here. The eastern quarter of Nebraska had some timber along the rivers, but west of the Missouri, the plains stretched endlessly with nothing but grass, wind, and the occasional creek bed lined with spindly wild plum thickets and cottonwoods too thin to build anything serious from. Shipping lumber in by railroad cost more than most homesteading families earned in months. Some estimates put the price of a basic wooden frame house at several $100s, a fortune for people who had arrived with $18 and a wagon. Until a dugout could be finished, families lived in their wagons or in canvas tents, which the prairie winds sometimes blew away entirely. One settler described watching a tent rip loose from its stakes during a spring storm and sail into the open grassland like a bedsheet. His wife and 2 children were still inside it when it started to lift. And a Nebraska winter didn't wait for anyone to figure out a better plan. That was 1863. By 1865, the answer was under their feet. The settlers who survived that first generation on the Great Plains didn't build their homes from wood or stone. They dug them out of the earth itself. The frontier dugout was a house made almost entirely of dirt, sod, and tangled grass roots, and it could be put together in a matter of days with nothing more than a spade, a breaking plow, and a team of oxen. It didn't require nails, lumber shipments, or waiting for a supply wagon that might not come before the snow did. And in every measurable way that mattered for survival, the dugout outperformed the expensive wooden frame houses that would eventually replace it. It couldn't catch fire. It didn't freeze in winter or cook its occupants in summer. And while tornadoes ripped above-ground structures apart across the open prairie, the dugout just sat there in its hillside, half buried and completely untouched. The clock was already ticking on this shelter, though. The people it saved would eventually throw it away, and not because it stopped working. It was 1863, and a family fresh off a wagon train in Custer County, Nebraska, had no walls, no roof, and roughly 6 weeks before the first hard frost would freeze the ground solid. The father hitched a heavy iron-breaking plow to a team of oxen and drove it into the virgin prairie. The thick blade cut through centuries of tangled root systems with a loud tearing sound, turning up an 18-inch ribbon of dense, root-bound earth. His wife and children followed behind with sharp spades, chopping that ribbon into blocks about 2 feet long and 4 to 6 inches deep. Each sod brick weighed close to 50 pounds, and every one of them had to be cut, carried, and stacked by hand. These bricks were the only building material available for hundreds of miles, and they turned out to be far better than anyone expected. Buffalo grass and bluestem prairie grass had been growing and tangling their roots together for centuries, creating a dense, woven mat of fibers that held each block together like natural reinforcement. The roots made up more than half of each brick's volume. Settlers learned fast that you had to use freshly cut sod the same day you sliced it. Leave it sitting overnight, and it dried out, cracked, and crumbled into useless clods. Timing mattered as much as technique. The ideal spot for a dugout was the east-facing slope of a low rolling hill, according to the Nebraska State Historical Society. Building into the hillside meant the earth itself formed 3 walls and most of the ceiling. The north wind would blow snow away from the entrance instead of piling it against the door, and the morning sun would light the dark interior through whatever window or opening the family could manage on the front wall, which was the only wall they actually had to build. A settler dug a rectangular pit into the hillside, 5 to 7 feet deep and 8 to 10 feet wide, with the length depending on how big the family was. The floor was smoothed with a spade and given a slight downward slope toward the entrance, so any water that seeped in would drain out on its own. For the front wall, settlers stacked sod blocks like bricks if that was all they had, or used cottonwood logs if a creek ran nearby. They left a gap for a door and sometimes a window, both of which were typically store-bought items hauled from the nearest railroad town, sometimes across dozens of miles of open prairie. The roof was the hardest part, and also the most important. If the roof failed, the whole structure failed, because the endurance of those sod walls depended on staying dry, and only a solid roof kept the rain from dissolving them. Cottonwood poles were laid side by side across the top of the pit to form beams. Over those went a thick layer of coarse prairie grass for insulation and to prevent dirt from sifting through the gaps between the logs. On top of that, the family fitted a careful double layer of sod blocks, grass side up, overlapping at the seams the way a bricklayer staggers a wall. Then they waited for rain. The first good downpour started that rooftop sod growing, the roots knitting together and binding the blocks into a single living mat. Within weeks, the dugout roof was covered in waving prairie grass, nearly invisible against the surrounding hillside. From 50 yards away, the only sign that a family lived there was a thin iron stovepipe poking up through the ground. The whole project, from first shovel cut to a family sleeping inside, could be finished in less than a week. Compare that to a freestanding sod house, which took considerably longer because all 4 walls had to be built up from scratch, or a frame house that required lumber nobody could afford. Speed mattered on the frontier. Every day without shelter was a day your family was exposed to weather that could kill. That near invisibility was more than camouflage. It was the first clue that the dugout was doing something no other frontier shelter could match. Prairie fires were one of the deadliest threats on the Great Plains, and they were terrifyingly common. A wall of flame driven by high wind could cross miles of dry grassland in minutes, moving faster than a man could run. Frame houses, built from thin wooden walls with no fireproofing, were kindling waiting for a spark. Settlers told stories of watching their neighbors' clapboard homes disappear in a single afternoon, leaving nothing behind but a stone chimney and a pile of hot ash. The dugout just sat there. Walls of packed earth, roof of living soil and tangled roots. Fire swept over a dugout the way water rolls over a stone. The structure didn't have enough combustible material to catch, and the earth walls were too dense and damp to ignite even if they did. In an era before electricity, when a single upset oil lamp inside a home could cost a family everything they owned, the dugout was the closest thing to fire insurance that existed on the American frontier. One settler wrote that sod houses were the best insurance you could have, and he wasn't exaggerating. But fire was only one of the threats the dugout shrugged off. The Great Plains are one of the most extreme climates anywhere in North America. Summer temperatures regularly pushed past 100 degrees across Kansas and Nebraska. Winter blizzards brought howling wind and temperatures that killed exposed livestock in hours. The frame houses that replaced dugouts were genuinely miserable in both seasons, built with thin walls, no insulation, and poorly crafted joints that let wind whistle through. More than a few settlers who upgraded from a dugout to a wooden house looked back and admitted the dugout had been more comfortable. The physics behind that comfort were simple but effective. Below about 4 or 5 feet of depth, the ground maintains a relatively stable temperature year-round, somewhere around 50 to 60 degrees regardless of what's happening on the surface. A family inside a dugout in the dead of January, with a small iron stove burning dried buffalo chips, could keep their single room warm and livable while a blizzard screamed overhead. In July, the same family stayed cool without any effort at all, because the earth surrounding them never got hot in the first place. The thick sod walls and double-layered roof acted as natural insulation that modern builders, with all their spray foam and fiberglass, would genuinely respect. That's the kind of performance that makes architects pay attention, even 150 years later. And then there were the tornadoes. The Great Plains sit in the heart of what we now call Tornado Alley, and the late 1800s were no exception. A full dugout, built into a hillside with most of its structure below ground level, offered protection that no above-ground home could come close to matching. The wind passed right over it. Families who had both a dugout and a frame house would abandon the frame house and sprint for the dugout every single time dark clouds stacked up on the western horizon. Even after the dugout era ended and families moved into wooden houses full-time, many old dugout sites were converted into storm cellars and tornado shelters, because everybody remembered that the safest place to be when the sky turned green was underground. The earth itself was the shelter. It had been there all along, waiting for someone to use it. One account from the Oklahoma Territory described a settler who had invested heavily in a proper wooden house, only to see it lifted off its foundation by a tornado and deposited in pieces across a quarter-mile of prairie. His neighbor, who still lived in a dugout carved into a nearby rise, didn't lose a single belonging. The next morning, the man with the wrecked frame house asked his neighbor if he could sleep in the dugout until he rebuilt. So you had a home that couldn't burn, stayed comfortable through both deadly heat and deadly cold, and survived tornadoes that shredded everything else around it. You'd think people would have been grateful. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover forgotten history like this every week. By the 1870s, tens of thousands of dugouts dotted the prairie from the Texas Panhandle up through Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, and into the Canadian grasslands. One estimate suggests that perhaps 1 million sod dwellings of all types, counting both dugouts and freestanding sod houses, once spread across the prairies of Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas alone. Some of these communities grew large enough to support sod schoolhouses, sod churches, even sod courthouses, all built from the same prairie bricks. But living inside a dugout was a daily fight with the earth you'd buried yourself in, and the list of complaints was long. The most persistent problem was the ceiling. Dirt fell constantly from the roof and walls, coating everything below in a fine layer of grime. Tables, beds, cooking pots, clothing, nothing was safe from the slow rain of soil particles. Families pinned sheets of newspaper to the ceiling and walls with small, sharpened sticks, trying to create a barrier between the raw earth and their living space. Some stretched muslin cloth across the ceiling like a false canopy, creating a fabric safety net between the sod roof and the family below. The newspapers worked as a dirt barrier. The muslin worked even better, but both caught things that were worse than soil. Snakes would work their way through gaps in the sod overhead and drop onto the fabric barrier, sliding along inside the muslin where the family could see them but not reach them. Spiders nested in the dark spaces between the earth and the ceiling liner. Settlers in Nebraska described centipedes up to 7 inches long crawling across the newspaper overhead, the sound of their legs scratching on the paper audible in the quiet of a prairie night. One grandmother was sewing alone in her dugout near Comstock, Nebraska, when she heard her window shade rustling. She got up to investigate and found a bull snake had worked its way inside. According to her granddaughter, she hated snakes, and she had to deal with them constantly. You'd think someone would have mentioned this before families started digging. Nobody did. Then there was the rain problem. The sod roof didn't leak during a storm. It leaked after one. The thick prairie sod absorbed water like a sponge during a downpour, and then it dripped muddy water into the room below for 2 or 3 days straight as the moisture slowly worked through. Pioneer women described cooking meals while holding an umbrella over the stove with one hand, trying to keep mud out of the pot while dirt flaked from the walls and insects crawled across the newspaper ceiling above their heads. Floors were usually tamped earth, which sounds primitive and was. Some families could afford rough wooden planks, but most couldn't, so they treated the dirt floor the same way some indigenous women treated the floors of their teepees. They sprinkled the surface with water every day and swept it with crude brooms made from prairie grass until the packed earth became as hard and smooth as poured concrete. It was clean enough to live on, but it was still a dirt floor in a dirt room under a dirt roof. And then there were the cows. Sod roofs covered in living grass looked identical to the surrounding prairie to any grazing animal. A wandering cow would step right onto a dugout roof, and if the log supports underneath were old or weak, the animal crashed straight through the ceiling into the family's living room. The Nebraska State Historical Society noted that wagons rumbling across the prairie at night occasionally rolled over a dugout roof without the driver ever knowing a family lived below, knocking dirt into the room or even breaking through entirely. From the outside, a well-built dugout looked like nothing at all. That invisibility, which was such an advantage against fire and wind, became a hazard with livestock. The women who lived in these underground rooms carried the heaviest burden of making them livable. They were the ones sweeping the floors, pinning up newspapers, fighting the endless parade of insects, and cooking over fires fueled by dried buffalo dung. Settlers called them buffalo chips. Out on the treeless plains, wood was too scarce and too expensive to burn, so dried animal dung became the standard heating and cooking fuel for thousands of families. It burned hot, produced a surprisingly clean flame, and was free for the gathering on the open prairie. But it wasn't exactly what anyone had pictured when they signed up for free land in the American West. Some families went further in their fight against the cave-like conditions. Ambitious settlers located outcroppings of limestone rock on the prairie, burned the stone in a fire pit, and mixed the powder with screened sand to create a rough plaster for their interior walls. Whitewashing a dugout brightened the space considerably, helped seal out moisture and insects, and made the single room feel less like a burrow and more like an actual home. Others hung fabric on the walls, laid woven rugs over the packed earth floor, and placed wildflowers on the windowsill when the season allowed. A few families even kept a caged bird or a house cat, the bird for company and the cat for the mice that burrowed through the sod walls at night. Most dugouts consisted of a single room, roughly 12 feet by 12 feet, and furniture was kept to a bare minimum because there simply wasn't space for more. Beds were sometimes built directly into the walls, tables folded up or moved outside when weather permitted. Sewing machines, which were among the most valuable tools a frontier woman owned, were carried outside on clear days and squeezed back through the narrow doorway when storms rolled in. Crowded didn't begin to describe it. A family of 6 living in a single underground room the size of a modern bedroom was ordinary, not exceptional. If the dugout had stopped here, with its problems and its patchwork solutions, it might have survived as a permanent feature of the plains. Plenty of settlers wrote in letters and diaries that the dugout was surprisingly comfortable. Cool in summer, warm and snug in winter, easy to heat, and safe from everything the prairie could throw at it. The same soil that made the dugout possible was about to make it unnecessary. The fertile prairie sod, turned over in fall and broken down by winter freezing and thawing, produced enormous harvests of corn and small grains. Those bumper crops put money in the bank for the first time. And the moment a family had enough cash, the first thing they wanted was out of that hole in the ground. The clapboard house they traded up to was stifling hot in summer, barely insulated in winter, heated by expensive store-bought coal that had to be hauled from town and carefully rationed, and could burn down from a stray ember. The dugout they left behind was cool in July, warm in January, heated for free with buffalo chips gathered from the prairie, and completely fireproof. But the wooden house looked like a proper home. It sat above ground, with windows and a porch and painted walls. The dugout looked like a hole. That was the real reason it disappeared. Not failure, but embarrassment. Letters from the period are full of references to getting out of that hole as a marker of progress. Grandmothers who'd successfully raised children inside a dugout couldn't wait to move into what they called a more suitable home. The word suitable did a lot of heavy lifting in those letters. It meant respectable. It meant visible. It meant you'd made it. The desire to improve the family's social standing was the force that destroyed the dugout, not any engineering flaw in the design. The transformation happened fast. By the 1890s, railroads were pushing affordable lumber deep into the plains. Frame houses replaced dugouts across the prairie in less than a single generation. Most dugouts were abandoned, left to melt back into the hillsides they'd been carved from, their sod walls dissolving under rain and their cottonwood roof beams rotting quietly in the dark. A few survived as root cellars, storage rooms, or storm shelters. The vast majority simply returned to the earth, which, if you think about it, was always the plan. Nearly all of them are gone now. The Sandford Dugout in Nebraska is believed to be the only intact original dugout remaining in the state, and it was added to the National Register of Historic Places in the year 2000. The Dow's Sod House outside Comstock, Nebraska, a freestanding sod structure rather than a true dugout, also sits on the National Register as one of the last surviving examples of sod construction on the plains. But the dugout left a cultural imprint that lasted longer than any of the structures. Laura Ingalls Wilder lived in a sod dugout on the banks of Plum Creek in Minnesota in 1874, and she wrote about the experience in her Little House books, describing the leaky roof, the packed earth floor, and the odd coziness of living inside the ground. Willa Cather set her novel O Pioneers on the Nebraska Prairie, where sod structures formed the backdrop for immigrant family life. These books turned the dugout into a symbol of American stubbornness, the idea that you could build a life from literally nothing but the dirt under your boots. The settlers didn't invent the idea of living underground, though. Indigenous peoples across the Great Plains and the American Southwest had been building semi-subterranean pit houses for centuries before any Europeans set foot on the prairie. The Pawnee, the Mandan, and other nations understood perfectly well that the earth was the best insulation available. The fur traders and mountain men who preceded the homesteaders had also dug rough shelters into hillsides and riverbanks during the long trapping seasons. The Homestead Act settlers borrowed the concept, adapted it with their iron plows and sod-cutting techniques, and then abandoned it the moment prosperity gave them an alternative. The earth had been offering this shelter for as long as people had been digging into it. Engineers studying sustainable housing today sometimes point back to the frontier dugout as an early and accidental example of passive thermal design. The principle of partially burying a structure underground to take advantage of the Earth's stable temperature is now used in modern Earth-sheltered homes and underground buildings across the world. The physics that kept a Nebraska family warm in 1870 is the same physics that architects model with software today. The settlers didn't know the science behind what they were doing. They just knew that the hole in the ground was warmer than the tent, and that was enough. The frontier dugout was never meant to last forever. It was a temporary answer to an impossible problem, a way to keep a family breathing long enough to plant a first crop and scrape together enough money for something better. It did that job better than any other shelter available on the American plains. And then, the moment it succeeded, the families it saved looked at it and saw something to be ashamed of instead of something to be proud of. There is a particular kind of irony in a shelter that works so well that the prosperity it creates kills it. The dugout kept people alive through blizzards, droughts, prairie fires, and tornadoes. Those people planted crops in the rich soil. Those crops made money. And that money bought the lumber for a house that couldn't do a single one of the things the dugout could. The upgrade was a downgrade in every category except appearances. The settlers who replaced their dugouts with wooden houses called that progress. "My father was born in a sod house," one descendant said, speaking in the 1920s about a home most people by then could barely imagine. There was pride in that sentence, but also distance, the kind of distance you put between yourself and something you survived rather than something you chose. The dugout never burned. It never froze. It never fell. The people who lived in it just decided they deserved something that looked more like what they'd left behind. And in trading the shelter that worked for the house that looked right, they walked away from one of the most practical pieces of architecture the American frontier ever produced. If you want to see another forgotten chapter of frontier survival, that video is on screen now.